And now we get into some of the players. I don't think these players will necessarily come as a surprise, but a few will. And we're going to throw out some names that maybe Stealing Bananas listeners don't expect us to be on. But as we look to the future and look to the new exploitable opportunities, and we try and be as aggressive as possible in landing talent, maybe we'll come up with some players who would fit into structures in unusual ways. Then if you have one player on the entire universe of player options this season that you think drafters need to be on everywhere, is there a name that just jumps out to you, or do you have a better place to start the conversation?
No, that's a good place to start the conversation. Is Kyle Pitts, who we've talked about a lot and said maybe is sort of the key this year. And we have talked about him a lot recently, but you're talking about, I just keep feeling more and more aggressive about this stance. You're talking about a player who was 20, turned 21 as a rookie, showed very good peripherals in terms of target earning ability, even without anyone to really help take away any attention from him. He's big, he's fast, he splits out wide. We get to play him at tight end in fantasy. But I mean, I remember watching his highlights in college, and not that I was trying to compare him to Calvin Johnson, but like you always, when you watch players play in college, you're like, this guy reminds me of blank. And the only one that Kyle Pitts reminded me of, or the player that he reminded me of the most, was Calvin Johnson, this big, long strider who had breakaway speed for his size, and yet doesn't even look like he's running that fast. Like it just made me think of Calvin Johnson. Definitely has the size and athletic ability to win in the red zone. Only scored 1 touchdown last year. A big reason why I think people are a little bit off of him. It's interesting. I just did my Atlanta Falcons projection. He doesn't like blow away my projections, but part of that's because I didn't really bump his target share too much. And it is really, frankly, easy to see where he could become a really high target share type of player. Now that they have Drake London alongside him, they don't have a lot else. And if he does, I mean, he could be, even clear of the high-end tight end target shares, which, most tight ends have to block a little bit. Kelsey's one that we usually get a ton of routes from. Kittle blocks a decent amount. Marky Andrews blocks a decent amount. Pitts is one that he's like pretty much just playing wide receiver, right? To have a second-year receiver option that, again, plays tight end, fills that 1Z position, or if you're in tight end premium, gets bonus points for you, and is going, in some formats in the 3rd round. I mean, we've talked about him being a late first-round pick in basically any format, but the ability to take him in the 2nd round of every round. I mean, I almost want to start thinking about, we talked on the last show, I was 2 in on DJ Moore in the area where Cooper Kupp went. I want to start thinking about the other 2nd round picks, and I want to make sure to get some exposure to, because I feel like every single draft I want to take Kyle Pitts.
And the context here is just so important to remember, where this is a player who went for over 1,000 yards last season, averaged over 15 yards per catch. You mentioned only had the 20% target share last year, but even with the addition of Drake London, it's really easy to see how he could have that 25, 26% target share. Last year, Mark Andrews was at 27, Travis Kelce only at 22, George Kittle 23. I mean, you bump it a couple of spots, and he's into that range where he's going to separate from the rest of the tight ends. And that's almost without even looking at the talent, almost without looking at this potential 2nd-year bump. Now, Colin and I have gotten some feedback and a little bit of pushback on selecting him in some formats because of the claim that you can get some of these other tight ends so much later this season. I think that in some ways that's interesting, because I think that there are a few other tight ends who also go onto the list of must-draft players. And when we look at different formats, if you're in a 2 tight end format, then getting 2 of those must draft guys allow you to stick with just 2 tight ends. If you're in a 3 tight end format, then you're trying to actually get 3 guys who make a difference, right? Not just fill the spots. That's one of the things that we're looking at structurally. There's a difference between hitting the structure and just like filling what you need to fill, and hitting the structure with guys who have the upside to be league winners within that structure. Well, we've received some pushback because there are some other interesting names maybe later, but also because the Atlanta Falcons are going to have Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder pulling the trigger now. One of the concerns that I have about the Indianapolis Colts is that when you look at some of the arm strength numbers, proxies, what have you, for players last season, it looks like someone like Matt Ryan, for example, is much more washed up and done and really kind of over the cliff than someone like Tom Brady, who obviously gets a lot of attention because of how old he is. That concern about the Colts makes me a little bit skeptical about some of those ADPs, which, isn't a big deal. You just kind of avoid those players because they're either expensive and you don't get them anyway, or they're more or less free. So there's less risk if you're taking a Paris Campbell late, for example. But for me, that also kind of reflects back to the situation with the Falcons where, there are concerns. And if Kyle Pitts were in an offense with an elite QB, I think he'd be drafted right where Travis Kelce's being drafted. But I think that we are getting a discount based on what his price actually is. Do you feel like that's the case? If Kyle Pitts had a Patrick Mahomes or a Josh Allen or, even a Tom Brady, say, if he had one of those guys, would he be right there with Travis Kelce? Is that the reason that we're getting the price that we get? And are you concerned about Marcus Mariota?
I think the answer to the first question is yes. He would be right there with Kelce. The answer to the second question is a little bit. That's where I brought up my projections. I do think, and I'm a little concerned about Arthur Smith. His offenses just have been slower paced. The Titans were faster paced at times when he was there, but last year Atlanta was very slow paced, and Tennessee was at times also pretty slow paced while he was on staff there, and they want to be run heavy. And there's some concern, and Mariota's going to scramble a little. There's certainly some concern in overall pass volume. That is valid. But number one, I think that basically we're talking about the upside scenarios, right? And that was sort of the theme of the earlier show, this idea of like reaching for players that, more or less we could classify as small miss, big hit types. The arguments against Pitts are not about Pitts himself. They're that he can't really like return value. Not super concerned about that because I do feel very confident that if he stays healthy, even if this is a low volume offense and all of that, that he's going to have a pretty good year. He could have a sophomore slump, but that he's going to be a top probably 5 tight end and not be maybe the game breaker you thought you were getting in the second or the third round, but still provide an edge at a tight end position that looks really thin this year. So the small miss part of it, if Kelce has an awesome year, then that's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to win because Kelce went just a round higher, or if Kittle or Waller, really hit their high end outcomes, which look a little harder this year. If you really peel back the layers of their profiles, I think you can make a case for Waller. I think you can make a case for Kittle too, but both of them, the upside scenarios to me, it doesn't feel like 2022 is the year where these guys are going to have great seasons necessarily. Andrews is another one where after doing my projection for Baltimore, I got in on him a little bit more, but some concerns about pass volume as well. He's been very, very good per route. So you could basically say, okay, even if the Ravens don't throw a ton, if the Falcons don't throw a ton, then, same issue, right? And Andrews could really dominate targets if Bateman doesn't really take a step forward. Maybe Andrews is the 25+% target share guy. I can see sort of all of those points. The main thing that I would argue again is anything that's counter to Pitts it feels like a small miss thing. And I think you can, like I said, make that case with Andrews and maybe a couple of the other tight ends. A small miss won't hurt you necessarily as much at tight end. They feel stable enough. All of those guys near the top probably, but Pitts in particular is the one that in year 2, after the year 1 he had, again, at his ages, the upper bound, the very 1 percentile outcome is that he is like a Calvin Johnson, essentially, at some point. Maybe not to that degree, right? But if he's even 80% of Calvin Johnson, but playing tight end in fantasy football, right? I mean, he could like rewrite record books. And even if Atlanta is low volume, he's going to still produce if he's that good. He's going to have a high 20s target share suddenly. He's going to, be very efficient and productive. And Marcus Mariota, this is where I'll go, hey, back when he was a starting quarterback, he had Delaney Walker, and Delaney Walker had 3 good years. He threw to his tight end a little bit. That's not a major point, but I don't think Marcus Mariota is necessarily going to hold back a big tight end season. His history suggests basically the opposite. And Arthur Smith was on staff on those teams. It's part of the reason he had familiarity with Mariota, brought him in. He was with the Titans that long, dating all the way back to when Mariota started for them for a couple seasons. So, I mean, again, I'm saying Pitts is more of a wide receiver, not really even playing tight end. So maybe the Delaney Walker comp doesn't even work. That's not like my central thesis. My central thesis is small miss, and we don't know what the hit is. And I don't really see a lot of scenarios where I'm like upset that I took Pitts unless he's just okay and the other tight ends are great. That would be, the main one.
And when we think about tight end being not necessarily deeper, but more fun to play late this season, we're still in most cases talking about more or less filler points. Whereas when you talk about the extreme scenario for Pitts, I almost don't think you even need to go to that point, because the context suggests that he could easily hit a scenario that would make him a massive league winner without anything extraordinary happening. You talk about how he's potentially this young star receiver. We hear guys like Justin Jefferson talking about having a 2,000-yard season. You imagine that 2,000-yard, 20-touchdown season. It's easy to kind of envision that for Jamar Chase as well. Legitimate goals for those guys to try and reach. And then you just kind of scale it way down and think about, where will we be if Kyle Pitts hits 1,308, which is dramatically lower than 2020. And if he did that, then he would be an easy league winner at the tight end position, especially if you're drafting him in round 2 of FFPC, especially if you're drafting him in round 3 of Underdog.
Yeah, that's exactly how I would think about it. Like, you don't need the 2,000-yard season from the tight end. That's why, I was kind of saying the 80% of Calvin. You put that very well. Pitts might be the same answer for you, because we joked recently on the show about how high you have him ranked. But who other than Pitts would be the one guy that immediately jumps out to you?
Well, then here's where we need to take it a little bit contrarian and try and figure out what the scoop is with J.K. Dobbins ADP. And
this is not off the wall for you. How is this contrarian?
Well, because
because it's a running back.
It's a running back, and it's a running back who's probably not going to catch a lot of passes.
Yeah.
And that element of it I find a little bit intriguing, because you look at where we are with ADP. Jonathan Taylor is still number 1. Obviously, a lot of smart people have Christian McCaffrey even ahead of him. We've had him. We've had this as a dead heat a lot of the season. You made some arguments for Christian McCaffrey early. I put out an article explaining why I thought that Jonathan Taylor's ceiling was being underestimated. You don't even need to make any cases like that about Christian McCaffrey. It's basically just, can he stay healthy? But you have McCaffrey as this sort of unique. When we talk about legendary, I think that one of the pieces that's really cool from the last several years is Patrick Careen's legendary RB article. A lot of what I'm thinking about when talking about, should drafters be more aggressive, or are drafters not aggressive enough yet in 2022, really can be distilled down to this idea of going after the legendary type profiles and players. But the flip side of it that is also, I think, interesting now is you have Austin Eckler being drafted as the running back 3, a smaller back who is going to almost certainly lose a lot of touches this year. You have Najee Harris going as running back 4, a back who struggled massively with efficiency and is going to have even more hurdles with efficiency in all likelihood to just overcome this next year. You have Dalvin Cook at running back 5, who had a big fall off in efficiency last season as he continues to get a little bit older. You have Joe Mixon kind of in that range, a back who, yeah, I mean, he's with the Cincinnati Bengals, and you don't want to completely sell that. But I mean, Joe Mixon has a just a guy profile, and yet he's being drafted at the 1-2 turn. For so long in fantasy, the easiest thing to do, and it was just a ridiculous cheat code, would be to draft the pass catching running backs. I'm wondering if the opposite opportunity might be opening up at least a little bit when you see Derrick Henry in round 2 coming off of a monster 8-game performance last year. You see Nick Chubb in round 3, and you see J.K. Dobbins in round 5. And kind of what I would take this back to is this idea of, number one, we want to chase talent. And there's no question about that with Derrick Henry. Number 2, we want to chase talent that does have some access to these elite workloads. And one of the things that you see when you look at the running back position last season was that Derrick Henry had the number 1 ranked expected points per game, and by a wide margin. Now, a little bit of that is easier because he does have the big stretch at the beginning. If he had played the full season, that probably gets knocked down a little bit. But you're talking about a guy who was over 20 EP last year. When we look at these, this potential for a legendary season, we're looking at guys who can put up an EP in the 20-ish range and then can have access to fantasy points over expectation, where you get between 3 and 5. I mean, 5 is the extreme upside type of scenario. We saw 4 last year from Henry. We saw 4.4 from Taylor. We saw 4.8 from Eckler. Eckler, one of these guys who probably a lot closer to Christian McCaffrey in talent than he's given credit for. So it's cool to see him being drafted that early. Maybe he is being given credit for it because his EP numbers really don't justify a first-round pick. But then you go and look too, and you're thinking about history, and you're thinking, okay, well, Derrick Henry is getting older. A big chunk of these guys who are being drafted earlier are into this range where we know that complete collapse could be in the cards every season. But you pull up the range of outcomes tool and you see Jonathan Taylor there with easily the top projection, but then Derrick Henry is number 2. And number 2 sort of overall, but also a big gap between his high projection and that of Najee Harris, Austin Eckler, Dalvin Cook, all players who fall well below him. Is there any kind of sort of reaction here to a lot of fantasy managers selling Derrick Henry throughout all of this time period, being incredibly wrong last year, and then getting bailed out by the injury, and to where now, because of the injury, everybody feels like you can take a little bit of this sigh of relief, deep breath. There's no longer the pressure to take somebody like a Henry, with the 5th pick, with the 6th pick. It frees people up to pass on him. And one of the reasons that I also bring that up is that he fell so far in our pros versus Joes contest. That was interesting to me from the perspective of when you have sort of these industry analysts alternating with high stakes grinders, high stakes drafters who are very successful, and both profile is passing on him. Now, again, it's just a handful of people in this one draft, but we talked a little bit in the first show of the week that there are different sort of drafting profiles. You'll see different mixes from maybe a high stakes grinder versus an industry analyst versus maybe a third profile who you might consider a little bit of both. Somebody who came up, doing both things and still does a lot of both things. I asked that question to kind of lean into or to lead into the second question, which is when we're getting J.K. Dobbins in round 5 and 6 because there's extreme skepticism about the injury situation, or is there extreme skepticism about how this profile can score points? Because the second part of that equation, I think, is definitely wrong.
You're saying that the upside scenario for J.K. Dobbins is the Derrick Henry season.
And possibly even more.
Possibly even more.
Not necessarily more than what he did for the first 8 games last year. I mean, that's going to be very much.
Be it. And that was well ahead of Jonathan Taylor in fantasy points per game. He was a really interesting one. When I did my Titans projections, I mean, I really lowered his volume, and I still was like, I mean, I can see why people want to be on him. You know, it was a little bit crazy how much they used him. He went from, I believe it's like 20 carries a game in 2019 to like 23 to 27 last year. And last year he was catching more than a reception per game, more than he had ever had in a season. He was at like 2.3 receptions per game. I think his previous career high was 1.2. So it was almost like doubling, you know, when you talk about the very low volume that he has in terms of his receptions per game. So he's adding just a ton of touches per game. And, you know, I was writing about this in Signals at the time. It's like Vrabel was just trying to see how much he could push him until he broke, which is like sort of a silly thing, obviously, because he did break. But even if he comes back down to earth a little bit in that volume and that, you know, that usage, like I brought him way back. He looks like I usually assume health in my projections, and he looks like a dude that projects incredibly well relative to where he's priced, even without the receiving. And my projections always love their receiving backs, so, and most do. So that is pretty interesting, and I think he's somebody that, you know, in these spots where he really, really falls, I was kind of giving you crap a couple of weeks ago about considering him when we were talking a little bit about the answers to the 1-2 turn. I'm starting to open up to the idea of having a Derrick Henry or 2 teams this year. Dobbins, then, you know, on that line of thinking you were saying, I mean, to me, it's almost like not a concern in the 5th round. Like, no back in the 5th round is perfect. I do still want to be targeting the high-value touchbacks where I can. But, I mean, maybe even the better comparison is Nick Chubb. I don't know. Nick Chubb being a very efficient runner, much like Henry. So they're very similar comparisons. But the talent level, maybe that's just easier to grasp because Derrick Henry is Derrick Henry and sort of just feels like an alien. Dobbins could be a lot like Chubb, but at a multi-round discount. You've definitely sold me on Dobbins. I've been very happy to get him in those ranges. That excitement for his talent level that you've had. The lack of receiving definitely reduces sort of the error bar, the potential for a committee. You can see scenarios where he could be kind of a bigger miss if he's not good, if he's not right, if he's not really healthy, if he's not efficient, he's not catching passes, and he's not efficient, then how is he any different than, you know, Miles Sanders going multiple rounds behind him? But the bet on talent, it's not necessarily a small miss, big hit one. It's a wide range bet, right? It's essentially big miss, big hit type of a bet. It's also not much different than maybe we would think of as like the upside for Tony Pollard, who goes 2 rounds later on the thought that, and I've supported this thought, that he could take over a lot more work from Ezekiel Elliott, or Ezekiel Elliott could get injured. But J.K. Dobbins is the lead back and has that sort of same type of, I mean, Pollard catches a good amount of passes, but Dobbins will catch some passes. Anyway, I'm with you. I get it. Something that supports the range is the Lamar Jackson element that you've talked about recently, or you wrote about it actually in your most recent article. I really enjoyed that. That talked about a few different key running backs to target, and Dobbins was in that piece. You talked about the element that the rushing quarterbacks are going to provide to the rushing efficiency of the running back. We see that in the data. It makes perfect sense from a schematic perspective. Anytime Lamar is doing an inside handoff, the edge rushers have to respect the potential for him to pull the ball and do a read option and run around the edge. They can't just let Lamar Jackson have that. So it creates these rushing lanes inside. And that's what Dobbins is good at. And he was incredibly efficient in the 1 year we saw from him 2 years ago as a rookie in 2020. Averaged 6 yards per carry on 134 carries. Didn't get to see him last year. We don't necessarily know how healthy he's going to be, but 6 yards per carry immediately should put off red flags in most people's heads and say that's not sustainable. And yet, part of what we're talking about, number one, is that sometimes these things that look unsustainable are worth buying into in today's fantasy landscape where everyone is so used to regression that it gets almost over-baked in. And then number two, if you were going to say it could be sustainable or vaguely sustainable, or he could be at 5.5 yards per carry, which would still be amazing, you'd think it would be in an offense with Lamar Jackson. Like, there's other mitigating factors here that could actually relate to why he was at 6 in the first place and what his actual personal mean that we're regressing to is. And I don't think that's, a league average 4.1 yards per carry or whatever. I think it is probably, as Lamar Jackson's running back and as talented as he is, it's probably in the high 4s minimum, right? And if he's even better, maybe it's in the 5s. Maybe that's, his own personal mean based on the way defenses are going to have to play the Ravens. So Dobbins is a very, very interesting one in that regard. It offsets the efficiency, offsets some of the receiving concerns, as you said. And you can definitely see that profile playing out in the 5th round. I mean, I don't really have an issue with it in the 5th round.
And I appreciate you mentioning the article there. For anybody who still is a little bit skeptical, I encourage you to check that out. I look at it from a variety of different angles. We dive into the Advanced Stat Explorer. We talk about the split, yards before contact, yards after contact, why the yards before contact are actually very important, why the yards after contact are something you can probably count on more from J.K. Dobbins than maybe you're thinking about for a smaller back. Talk about some of the superstars from the past who have had a lot of seasons in this kind of range that we're talking about. It may seem too early to put Dobbins in that category, but when you're talking about a guy with a 4.39 40 at that size, what he did in college, what he did as a rookie, and then to finish out his rookie season, he had this extended stretch of time where he averaged 16.9 points per game. Now, again, you look at the hot stretch, and that can be misleading, but you have a back like that take a little bit of a step forward. One of the reasons why I'm on Dobbins, I don't think that there's going to be a committee that matters in any way like it does with some backfields. The Ravens are going to have so much run volume in all likelihood that they're probably going to have to work a lot more on limiting Dobbins' touches than trying to find him touches. Even if the other guys are healthy, even if the other guys are out there contributing, he's going to have all the carries he can use. He's going to fall into a few more receptions than I think people are going to have. It's going to be low, but the numbers based on yardage and touchdown range are just higher than people are thinking. They're easily within that group and within the scoring range that people are going to get by buying those running backs who are currently in the 2nd round. And so we talk about being aggressive and targeting some of these ranges where people are nervous. That ETN, Akers, Dobbins range is one of them. And part of me wants to target more than one in drafts. Now, we talked about how that can be risky, but if we're saying that some of the exploitable loopholes have closed in 2022, but others are opening, you think about some of the early round wide receivers you can take, and then how that round 3 to round 5 range is maybe less appealing than it's been in the past. Well, if that's less appealing, then what is the flip side of that? What are the opportunities that we might have? Should we be looking at these young dead zone backs? And one of the things that you said from the beginning, as the person who really popularized and helped explain the dead zone, is that you are still targeting young backs in that range. So, none of that is news to you in any way.
Yeah, it's this idea of the first time breakout that the reason they're going there is that drafters are skeptical of what they actually are. And with Dobbins, yeah, he's a year 3 back, but we didn't see him in year 2. And the injury, I think, mitigates that, or, is a mitigating factor as well, that drafters don't know what he is necessarily. We saw him in his rookie year. He was very good late, but we didn't really get the full season. And so, yeah, I mean, I think he fits that profile of the type of player that we've seen come out of the dead zone and actually have legitimate ceiling. And when I was originally looking at it, what I was looking at was not just guys that return value in the dead zone, but guys that were, much like Pat defined it, that had legendary seasons. Let's talk about some other players, though. We talk about Dobbins a lot. Do you got any other? You talked about some other tight ends. Is this just a Trey McBride thing, or where are we going with that?
Well, we want to be aware of some of these numbers the rookie tight ends put up last year, Kyle Pitts, Pat Freiermuth. But I do think it's worth mentioning again, now that we've had so much Dulcich enthusiasm, that Noah Fant and Albert O were both productive tight ends last season in this context where they were catching passes from extremely poor quarterbacks. Now they're going to be split. You pull up the stealing signals tool and you will see that Dulcich's numbers on a much lower route share, obviously not surprising as the backup, are not that dissimilar from the actual elite tight ends. You look at Noah Fant and say, well, if he is not competing with a tight end of that talent level and is making a lateral move, why would a tight end who has been productive in the past, was drafted really early? Now, I mean, he's been traded to another team who didn't obviously make that pick. And so in some ways, he's already being sold by his team and by the NFL. But sold in a situation where they had to give up something to get Russell Wilson. I mean, you were still not happy with the package for Russell Wilson, even though it included Noah Fant, who was a very high pick who has paid off. Both of those guys, extreme athletes and very good track records already established within their respective sample sizes. And I mean, they're not free, but Ben, these guys are extremely inexpensive. So when, listeners come to us and say, look, I mean, we understand you guys like Kyle Pitts, but there's less risk in targeting other big time athletes at ADPs that, I mean, you can barely see, they're so small. What are your thoughts on attacking those players? Because, I mean, again, tight end upside is going to be something that seems easy to get in the preseason. And then, you get into the year and Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews and, George Kittle win all the leagues. So, yep. And everybody else is saying, well, my tight end didn't cost me anything, but he's also not scoring for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think the realistic upside for those guys, I hear all the arguments, but the realistic upside for those guys is somewhere around, I mean, what I would call the realistic floor for Kelce and Andrews and Pitts, those guys. I mean, we're talking about, a tight end 5 type season, not a tight end 1 type season. I think they are guys you like to add in late round tight end builds for the reasons you said, but I don't see a lot of outcomes with Alberto or with Noah Fant where they are having, 1,000-yard seasons, right? So is it just touchdowns? It's a challenging, they could have stretches of production that are huge, but it's a challenging one there where, like you kind of said at the end, I think that distilled my opinion the strongest. We see late round tight ends succeed sometimes. They do very well. They're big pieces to have when they have a tight end 5 season from the double-digit rounds. We don't really see many return tight end 1 seasons. You can go back to like Jordan Reed the year he broke out. He did it, at least on points per game. I know Kittle's breakout year, he was a later round pick, and it was a big year. I don't know if it was tight end 1, though. But just with the way the passing games are evolving and the elite tight ends, I think you kind of need all 5 of the top tight ends to really have tough years, and then you can be the tight end 1, and that can happen. That happens some seasons.
So it sounds like you're not as enthusiastic still about Geno Smith, even as he runs away with the starting QB position there in Seattle.
I mean, it'll be fun. It'll be a fun experiment, right? We've talked a ton about Trey Lance, but he has to fit into this conversation where I've said that I think he belongs basically right behind Jalen Hurts. But I think we saw what a full season of Hurts looks like. And one of the things I said about doing the San Francisco projection, I didn't feel like I did doing the Lance projection since I did Lamar Jackson's in his second season, where you look at the past data. It's a small sample, but you're saying, I can project 200 rushes for this player as a quarterback. If Trey Lance runs 200 times, he's better than Jalen Hurts. He's a top 3 quarterback probably. He's running for 1,000 yards probably. He's running for a lot of touchdowns. Their offense is probably, producing. Or otherwise, that might seem like they're not producing if their quarterback's running 200 times, but it's a scenario obviously where Lance is playing well enough to play a lot of games, and they're probably pretty run heavy, which means they're probably in some favorable scripts. It gets back to some of Lamar Jackson's best seasons. I don't think he's going to run 200 times. Lamar Jackson has never run 200 times, but it's that's a guy where he goes that I just don't understand.
The QB situation is interesting for me because I think it does kind of go back to our discussion of aggressiveness, the theme of aggressiveness, but this idea of patient but aggressive. I also want to ask you about QB in different formats because it's really going to be very different in redraft versus best ball. In best ball, if you're a more casual player, maybe you're doing 20 leagues. If you're a hardcore player, maybe you're doing 50 to 100. You can get a lot of different mixes there. If your Trey Lance teams blow up, maybe that doesn't concern you as much. And you also have the second quarterback, and in some cases the third quarterback, to help bail him out if he does start but is bad. I mean, if he starts but is bad, he's going to be fine in fantasy, which is all part of the thesis, because if he starts and is good, then you have a league winner. In redraft, where the QBs are going to fall, and then in some ways you're more attached to your main guy. He's going to play more often. You have to decide to start sit. You're really gambling on that top option scoring a lot of points for you. That perhaps presents a little bit of a different question, especially then if we're saying, okay, in terms of teams we're going to actively manage, just realistically, maybe we're going to be, if you're a very heavy drafter, you're in the, 20 type of range, maybe, 10 main events and 10 other types of things. If you're just a more reasonable fantasy enthusiast, maybe you have, 3 to 8 teams. And so Trey Lance could really take your season apart if he does poorly. Let's start with the best ball side to begin with. Obviously, there's a ton of enthusiasm for best ball out there, and we have lots of Underdog and FFPC Best Ball listeners. Partly this, again, is just going to kind of go to what your structural preference is and what you think that the evidence indicates. But I really like to get the 2 QBs in the window, and I think that that's the aggressive play. Whereas taking the elite QB and then maybe taking a lower end QB, the numbers are not as strong for that, which is probably the number one thing for me. But I also think there's in some ways less aggressiveness. When you have the 2 guys in that window, you have 2 shots at it. You could hit twice as opposed to just once, which is going to give you even more full season upside as you're trying to first make it to the tournament. Then you have the 2 different plays. Once you're in the tournament, you could beat a lot of different combinations that other drafters have by having one QB get you through 1 week and sort of alternating them as other players who have some overlap with you are eliminated. I really like these QBs in that range from Kyler Murray, who does sometimes fall into that round 6-ish range, which we would generally consider the start of the window, through, say, Derek Carr, QB 13-ish, and then obviously you and I like Justin Fields, at least sprinkling him in as someone who is really the end of QB window. Do you like having the two big-time players here? And I mean, you mentioned Trey Lance. Tom Brady now has crazy weapons. Russell Wilson seems like he's going to be a very good fit for, you know, what they want to do, and just, again, has so many weapons. Matthew Stafford, I've seen him drafted so early in a lot of drafts in the last week because Allen Robinson is evidently going to be the wide receiver 2 behind Cooper Kupp at wide receiver 1 this year. Obviously, those guys will carry Matthew Stafford to a pretty good season. There's a lot of interesting profiles here as well, where you can mix in the guys who are going to throw a lot, are going to throw a lot of touchdowns, are going to be heavily reliant on those stud receivers. And then obviously the players like a Kyler Murray, a Jalen Hurts, a Trey Lance, and even to an extent a Justin Fields, who have that hybrid upside and present different types of options for you in a best ball format.
In best ball, I kind of think of Lance as, you know, you're talking about the aggressive 2 QB window type of approach. I mean, I think it's a perfect format for Lance because being able to get him at QB 10 when I think he's a QB 6 type player, QB 6, 7, you know, it doesn't just allow you to get 2 QBs in the window. It allows you to potentially get 2 like in the front end of the window because you think one is so mispriced. In other formats, there is a challenge because if you hold off and wait and you're, you know, I'm going to get Lance, you might not get him, obviously. Sometimes he does go a lot higher, and you have to then make some other decisions. And I guess it doesn't really matter on format. It's the same. When I look at Lance, I just think he's undervalued. And sort of the same calculus. The 2 QB thing is different, you know, in best ball, because you can still take Kyler or Lamar or whoever and then get Lance later. But the challenge that I've had with Lance in most of my drafts is that I want him, and yet I also really like the profiles for most of the other quarterbacks you mentioned. I would stop it at about QB 11. I don't really include Matthew Stafford in it. You're higher than me on Derek Carr. Justin Fields, to me, big fan, but don't think he has the upside to contend with the top 10 or 11. But Russell Wilson, Tom Brady, Dak Prescott in that range right around Lance. Maybe not Prescott so much. Maybe having Prescott in there, I don't know. He might be more of like the Stafford, Carr, Fields for me. But Brady and Wilson are guys that I see pretty good paths for. The top 6 quarterbacks, certainly. Joe Burrow is QB 7 and kind of fits in between this discussion. He's maybe a little bit overpriced for my liking, even though I absolutely love Cincinnati's passing game. But yeah, I mean, I want maybe not an exposure to Josh Allen necessarily, but I'd love to get it at the right price. Justin Herbert's a guy I'd love to have on fantasy teams, but he's just so expensive, right? But Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Jalen Hurts, I like all their profiles. So the challenge for me with Lance is more about picking the spots where I think he'll make sense, or I'm pretty confident I'll be able to get him as I'm passing through the other quarterbacks that I like in the sort of the elite range. Because once Lance goes off the board, I actually do think you're starting to really drop off in upside profiles. I do think somebody of the Dak, Stafford, Derek Carr, Fields group, Aaron Rodgers, whoever you want to throw in, you know, I guess Deshaun Watson has to be thrown in here as well. Somebody in there probably has quite a bit of ceiling or has an outcome in them that pushes them up into the higher ranges. But in terms of like floor to ceiling and really feeling comfortable in a 1 QB league, I mean, it's sort of Lance that ends it for me. and you start to get into more questionable profiles. So the challenge for me with him is always, do I want to play chicken a little bit with Trey Lance, or do I want to take a good value that I see in the earlier rounds? A lot of times, if I find a good value, a quarterback I like, Lamar Jackson or somebody has fallen quite a bit behind ADP, and it gets flat in that 6th round range with wide receivers, I'm comfortable pulling the trigger on Lamar because I don't really want to play the Trey Lance chicken game necessarily if I don't have to, and I do just basically want to mix up my exposures. But in a perfect world, I think I would be basically just trying to get Trey Lance in every single draft. Maybe that's way too aggressive, but that's where I'm at with how egregiously priced he is.
And so when we flip back over to redraft, it's interesting to me that you're not seeing as big a discount as you might expect when we go from a format that requires 2 QBs contributing to going to a format that you could really get by with 1. Right now, the prices do get to be less, but not, I mean, there should be just much, much, much bigger discounts. And yet, because we're not seeing that, we have to play the price environment that exists. And one of the things about that price environment is that round 9 to round 12, which does have some members of this group, it has Trey Lance for one thing, but also has some guys at the beginning of it, like a Russell Wilson or a Tom Brady. If you are a Derek Carr or a Kirk Cousins fan, you can get those guys in rounds 11 and 12 respectively. But there's a lot of overlap between this group and the priority 0 RB targets. And you go to the Win the Flex tool, you look at different formats from different seasons, and the one thing that you find, you go back to it over and over and over, is that the running backs in this range tend to be your league winners who come from here, score a lot of points, and allow you to do a lot of things structurally to win overall. It allows you to build that wide receiver firepower that is crucial in basically every format that the fantasy has. And so perhaps you don't want to select the QBs from that group or to overemphasize that range, because there actually is a cost, even though that cost is in round 9 through round 12, as opposed to earlier. And then you contrast that with some of the prices early on. Now, Josh Allen goes in the 3rd round. We're talking about FFPC Main Event from the last week and a half. He goes in between AJ Brown and DJ Moore, which, I mean, anytime you put in between those 2 names for Ben, he's not even going to be able to see Josh Allen. But then you go a couple of rounds later and you see Patrick Mahomes drafted at the 5-12. The wide receiver right ahead of him is Darnell Mooney. The wide receiver right after him is Chris Godwin. You look at Lamar Jackson in round 6. The wide receiver right ahead of him is Juju. But the 2 names right after Lamar Jackson are Amari Cooper and Adam Thielen. So if you are sitting there and Lamar Jackson is available, the wide receivers that you could pick are not going to push you heavily in a different direction. Kyler Murray then a few picks later at the 6-12. When we talk about being aggressive, Ben, when we talk about this new quarterback landscape where there appears to be, and we'll see if these trends continue, but a stronger relationship between QB ADP and QB scoring, and you think about, number one, how do we manage the start-sit decisions and maybe maximize our total roster spots as well? And then number 2, upside for tournaments. I think that in redraft, you can make a very strong argument that aggressiveness at the QB position in 2022 is going to pay off nicely.